Okay, here we are. I'm Jeffrey Fox, and we're on the fourth of these sub-lectures in the Hadoop and MapReduce section of the class, our cloud computing class. So let's get. Okay, we're looking at tasks in Hadoop, and the tasks are just the individual processes running, often one process per core, sometimes more, because you might have I/O delays. It all depends on the application, and we have map task and reduce task, and each of those managed separately. We will also learn about the communication between the maps and the reduce, which are done by partitioning, which tells you how the parallelism is implemented, sorting, which takes the key value pairs and sorts them by key, combine, which does some work on the node, and merge, which does work between the nodes to try to speed up the shuffle, which is the actual sending of the data from the maps to the reducers. Okay, let's get going on tasks in Hadoop. Thank you. All right, so an application consists of a set of tasks, both map tasks and reduce tasks. And the input data to the map task is stored in HDFS, possibly through HBase. And there are various input format specifications, which which is also doing the splitting, because you want to remember partition the data to do parallel computing, and you do an input split, and then you assign one input split to each map task. And it provides the input split allows the job to read in a stream of bytes, which are then key value pairs. And you have a block of data, which is multiple key value pairs. You need to have lots and lots of key value pairs in one split, because otherwise the overhead of chopping it up will be too much. You don't want one key value pair in each split. You want 10,000 or some largest number, so the overhead of splitting it up is not too high. Another possibility you could do is have more map tasks than there are cores. Then you could split everything up and have some of the maps not running. That gives you more chance of actually balancing the load if the maps have different capacities. Because if a short map task finishes, you can then reschedule it with one of these other ones that's been waiting, because you assigned, say, 4 times as many map tasks as there were cores. Okay, let's look at map tasks in Hadoop. Remember, we have map task and reduce task. The maps run, and then they write the answer to disk, and then the reducers read the answers from the disk. So using disks makes everything fault tolerant. We have slots. They're typically cores on a typical multi-core system. And there's a job tracker which assigns map tasks to map slots. And there's lots of papers, including some written by me, on how the best way to do that. Which are well-known, MP complete, impossible to solve in principle, but easy to solve in practice problem. Then we need to decide which key gets processed by which reducer. That is done by a hash function typically. And this illustrates we're using parallelism over keys to implement our horizontal scaling over lots of nodes to do the whole problem. And such partitioners are used in all aspects of parallel computing, not just in MapReduce. We did this 100 years ago when we first started this. There is a combiner, which is a part of the system, which is didn't exist on day one, but now exists. And it notes that if you have multiple map tasks on a single node, which you will do in a multi-core chip, it is best to do the combinations on the chip, not by sending it to some reducer living off in a different node maybe, and separated by disk. So combiner does the reduce operation, but the reduce operator combined to a node. This is typical, actually, again, in all parallel computing. You need to separate intranode between the nodes and internode inside the nodes, because the trade-off in communication costs and everything is very different in between these cases. And so that's a particular example of a rather common feature of parallel computing systems, so it's worthwhile noting it. Here is a general picture of what's going on here. We have moving the data from the map task to the reduce task. Here's the mapper. Results of the mapper here. This goes to a shuffler and a merge, which are basically preparing the data, these key value pairs, in ordered fashion so that they can be efficiently reduced by the reduce tasks. And then those reduced tasks store everything on HDFS. These things up here are also stored on HDFS. They're the results of the map tasks. Reduce is also, logically it's the same as a mapper, except it just does a different task. It runs in parallel because you can add things up. And let's take the simplest reduce we saw, adding up the counts in word count or adding up the number of events in a histogram bin. Those can all be done in parallel. And there are actually quite clever algorithms to do such so-called reductions in parallel. In general, it requires fewer reduced tasks than map tasks, although in the highest performance implementation, MPI, there are exactly the same number of reduced tasks as map tasks. So it's, but Hadoop has a much stronger separation between map and reduce than MPI. In MPI, they're all merged together, which makes this efficient. Shuffling, I've already mentioned that shuffling is needed to make certain you get to each reducer the data it wants. It effectively sorts the data using HTTP to fetch the data off disks, and it is waiting for the map task to finish. And it uses copier threads, which actually do this task of reorganizing the data and sending it to the right place. Here is another example of this. We have the mappers. They produce key value pairs. And they're sorted and sent. They're merged together as needed for the reduction. So each reducer has the data it wants and only the data it wants. The reducer will often just say it's given 1,000 keys. It will add up the values for each of those 1,000 keys. And this other reducer will have another set of keys, or sometimes which could be in some keys are shared between reducers. We saw that with the juice example, where the orange key got sent to multiple blenders. Here's a rather nice picture about the overall architecture with the mappers, the sorters, the shufflers, and then on the next slide we have the shuffler. It's just as repeated, the merging of the results from the different shuffles, and then finally the reduction. So this is actually quite a high-resolution picture. So I don't think it's useful to go through it in these slides. You can just study this in detail. There is a link if you want to just bring it up on your computer in its original fashion. Here I've chopped up a single original picture into two parts to fit on the slide. Okay, this slide here describes the cosmic route of a single instance, a key value, which start off with value equal to 1 for a certain key, but then they all get accumulated, so the value increases. And those instances are produced by maps. Combine takes the results of different maps on the same node and adds them up, so that that's done on the node level, not in the final reduce state, which is cross nodes. Then you sort follows combine and takes these instances and sorts by the key value, because typically each Each key is reduced on a different thing. Actually, a particular reducer has multiple keys, but all keys are done on one particular reducer. You don't reduce some of the instances of a particular key on one reducer and the other on a different reducer. So shuffle is actually the operation that does the communication, which is the output of the sort combined and sends it to the reducers. And then on the way, the merge is used to do, you have more combination of a distributed fashion to combine records with common keys. And then the reduce operation does the problem-specific reduction. The simplest is add, but max and others are, of course, possible reduction operations. Then you might have steps aggregating the results of different reduction operations, because you would, well, if we're going to do an average, we want to do a reduce of the total number of things that of the values we're adding and doing an average of, and also the total number of instances. Here we have the reducers, which are very straightforward. The user specifies the output format, and the reducer does its thing. Notice in many Hadoop jobs, it's done pretty inefficiently. You just have a single reducer, which say adds up the results of all the maps. That is extremely inefficient. It's much better to do parallel reduction. Because if you're summing from 1 to 1 billion, you can actually take it in groups of 1,000 or 10,000 and add up whatever it is, 10 to the 5th, reduce tasks, each of 10 to the 4th numbers. That will be a wonderful parallel job. There is an output format defined in Hadoop when you specify it. The usual output format is key value pairs, but there are some other ones for sequence files and null, no output, and also a streaming example. All right, so these are all things you specify when you run your Hadoop job. Okay, so that's the end of this section. Thank you.